The Ivory Child, the adventure novel by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 1. Allan gives a shooting lesson. Now I, Allan Quatermain, come to the story of what was perhaps one of the strangest of all the adventures which have befallen me in the course of a life that so far can scarcely be called tame or humdrum. Amongst many other things it tells of the war against the White Kendah people and the death of Jana, their elephant god. Often since then, I have wondered if this creature was, or was not, anything more than a mere gigantic beast of the forest. It seems improbable, even impossible, but the reader of future days may judge of this matter for himself. Also, he can form his opinion as to the religion of the White Kendah and their pretensions to a certain degree of magical skill. Of this magic, I will make only one remark. If it existed at all, it was by no means infallible. To take a single instance, Harut and Maru were convinced by divination that I, and I only, could kill Jana, which was why they invited me to Kendahland. Yet in the end, it was Hans who killed him. Jana nearly killed me. Now to my tale. In another history, called The Holy Flower, I have told how I came to England with a young gentleman of the name of Scroop, partly to see him safely home after a hunting accident, and partly to try to dispose of a unique orchid for a friend of mine called Brother John by the white people and Dogita by the natives, who was popularly supposed to be mad, but in fact was very sane indeed. So sane was he that he pursued what seemed to be an absolutely desperate quest for over 20 years, until, with some humble assistance on my part, he brought it to a curiously successful issue. But all this tale is told in The Holy Flower, and I only allude to it here, that is at present, to explain how I came to be in England. While in this country I stayed for a few days with Scroop, or rather with his fiancée and her people, at a fine house in Essex. I called it Essex to avoid the place being identified, but really it was one of the neighbouring counties. During my visit I was taken to see a much finer place, a splendid old castle with brick gateway towers that had been wonderfully well restored and turned into a most luxurious modern dwelling. Let us call it Ragnall, the seat of a baron of that name. I had heard a good deal about Lord Ragnall, who, according to all accounts, seemed a kind of admirable Cretan. He was said to be wonderfully handsome, a great scholar. He had taken a double first at college, a great athlete. He had been captain of the Oxford boat at the university race, a very promising speaker who had already made his mark in the House of Lords, a sportsman who had shot tigers and other large game in India, a poet who had published a successful volume of verse under a pseudonym, a good solider, until he left the service, and lastly, a man of enormous wealth, owning, in addition to his estates, several coal mines and an entire town in the north of England. "Dear me," I said when the list was finished, "he seems to have been born with a whole case of gold spoons in his mouth. I hope one of them will not choke him," adding, "perhaps he will be unlucky in love." "That's just where he is most lucky of all," answered the young lady to whom I was talking. It was Scroop's fiancée, Miss Manners, for he is engaged to a lady that I am told is the loveliest, sweetest, cleverest girl in all England, and they absolutely adore each other. "Dear me," I repeated, "I wonder what fate has got up its sleeve for Lord Ragnall and his perfect lady-love." I was doomed to find out one day. So it came about that when on the following morning I was asked if I would like to see the wonders of Ragnall Castle, I answered yes. Really, however, I wanted to have a look at Lord Ragnall himself, if possible, for the account of his many perfections had impressed the imagination of a poor colonist like myself, who had never found an opportunity of setting his eyes upon a kind of human angel. Human devils I had met in plenty, but never a single angel, at least of the male sex. Also, there was always the possibility that I might get a glimpse of the still more angelic lady to whom he was engaged, whose name, I understood, was the Honourable Miss Holmes. So I said that nothing would please me more than to see this castle. Thither we drove accordingly through the fine, frosty air, for the month was December. On reaching the castle, Mr. Scroop was told that Lord Ragnall, whom he knew well, was out shooting somewhere in the park, but that, of course, he could show his friend over the place. So we went in, the three of us, for Miss Manners, to whom Scroop was to be married very shortly, had driven us over in her pony carriage. The porter at the gateway towers took us to the main door of the castle and handed us over to another man, whom he addressed as Mr. Savage, whispering to me that he was his lordship's personal attendant. I remember the name, because it seemed to me that I had never seen anyone who looked much less savage. In truth, his appearance was that of a duke in disguise, as I imagined dukes to be, for I never set eyes on one. His dress, he wore a black morning cutaway coat, was faultless. His manners were exquisite, polite to the verge of irony, but with a hint of haughty pride in the background. He was handsome also, with a fine nose and a hawk-like eye, while a touch of boldness added to the general effect. His age may have been anything between 35 and 40, and the way he deprived me of my hat and stick, to which I strove to cling, showed, I thought, resolution of character. Probably, I reflected to myself, he considers me an unusual sort of person who might damage the pictures and other objects of art with the stick, and not seeing his way how to ask me to give it up without suggesting suspicion, has hit upon the expedient of taking my hat also. In after days, Mr. Samuel Savage informed me that I was quite right in this surmise. He said he thought that, judging from my somewhat unconventional appearance, I might be one of the dangerous class of whom he had been reading in the papers, namely a anarchist. I write the word as he pronounced it, for here comes the curious thing. This man, so flawless, so well instructed in some respects, had a fault which gave everything away. His H's were uncertain. 3 of them would come quite right, but the 4th, let us say, would be conspicuous either by its utter absence or by its unwanted appearance. He could speak when describing the Ragnall pictures in rotund and flowing periods that would scarcely have disgraced the pen of Gibbon. Then suddenly that H would appear or disappear, and the illusion was over. It was like a sudden shock of cold water down the back. I never discovered the origin of his family. It was a matter of which he did not speak, perhaps because he was vague about it himself. But if an Earl of Norman blood had married a handsome Cockney kitchen maid of native ability, I can quite imagine that Samuel Savage might have been a child of the Union. For the rest, he was a good man, and a faithful one, for whom I have a high respect. On this occasion he conducted us round the castle, or rather its more public rooms, showing us many treasures and, I should think, at least 200 pictures by eminent and departed artists, which gave him an opportunity of exhibiting a peculiar, if somewhat erratic, knowledge of history. To tell the truth, I began to wish that it were a little less full in detail, since on a December day those large apartments felt uncommonly cold. Scroop and Miss Manners seemed to keep warm, perhaps with the inward fires of mutual admiration, but as I had no one to admire except Mr. Savage, a temperature of about 35 degrees produced its natural effect upon me. At length we took a short cut from the large to the little gallery through a warmed and comfortable room, which I understood was Lord Ragnall's study. Halting for a moment by one of the fires, I observed a picture on the wall, over which a curtain was drawn, and asked Mr. Savage what it might be. "That, sir," he replied, with a kind of haughty reserve, "is the portrait of her future ladyship, which his lordship keeps for his private eye." Miss Manners sniggered, and I said, "Oh, thank you. What an ill-omened kind of thing to do." Then, observing through an open door the hall in which my hat had been taken from me, I lingered, and as the others vanished in the little gallery, slipped into it, recovered my belongings, and passed out to the garden, purposing to walk there till I was warm again, and Scroop reappeared. While I marched up and down a terrace on which, I remember, several very cold-looking peacocks were seated, like conscientious birds that knew it was their duty to be ornamental, however low the temperature, I heard some shots fired, apparently in a clump of ilex oaks which grew about 500 yards away, and reflected to myself that they seemed to be those of a small rifle, not of a shotgun. My curiosity being excited as to what was to be an almost professional matter, I walked towards the grove, making a circuit through a shrubbery. At length I found myself near to the edge of a glade, and perceived, standing behind the shelter of a magnificent ilex, 2 men. One of these was a young keeper, and the other, from his appearance, I felt sure must be Lord Ragnall himself. Certainly he was a splendid-looking man, very tall, very broad, very handsome, with a peaked beard, a kind and charming face, and large dark eyes. He wore a cloak upon his shoulders, which was thrown back from over a velvet coat, and, except for the light double-barreled rifle in his hand, looked exactly like a picture by Van Dyck, which Mr. Savage had just informed me was that of one of his lordship's ancestors of the time of Charles I. Standing behind another oak, I observed that he was trying to shoot wood pigeons as they descended to feed upon the acorns, for which the hard weather had made them greedy. From time to time, these beautiful bluebirds appeared and hovered a moment before they settled, whereon the sportsman fired, and they flew away. Bang, bang, went the double-barreled rifle, and off fled the pigeon. "Damn," said the sportsman in a pleasant, laughing voice. "That's the 12th I have missed, Charles." "You hit his tail, my lord. I saw a feather come out. But, my lord, as I told you, there ain't no man living what can kill pigeons on the wing with a bullet, even when they seem to sit still in the air." "I have heard of one, Charles. Mr. Scroop has a friend from Africa staying with him who, he swears, could knock over 4 out of 6. "Then, my lord, Mr. Scroop has a friend what lies," replied Charles, as he handed him the second rifle. This was too much for me. I stepped forward, raising my hat politely, and said, "Sir, forgive me for interrupting you, but you are not shooting at those wood pigeons in the right way. Although they seem to hover just before they settle, they are dropping much faster than you think. Your keeper was mistaken when he said that you knocked a feather out of the tail of that last bird at which you fired 2 barrels. In both cases, you shot at least a foot above it, and what fell was a leaf from the ilex tree." There was a moment's silence, which was broken by Charles, who ejaculated in a thick voice, "Well, of all the cheek!" Lord Ragnall, however, for it was he, looked first angry and then amused. "Sir," he said, "I thank you for your advice, which no doubt is excellent, for it is certainly true that I have missed every pigeon which I tried to shoot with these confounded little rifles. But if you could demonstrate in practice what you so kindly set out in precept, the value of your counsel would be enhanced." Thus he spoke, mimicking, I have no doubt, for he had a sense of humor, the manner of my address, which nervousness had made somewhat pompous. "Give me the rifle," I answered, taking off my greatcoat. He handed it me with a bow. "Mind what you are about," growled Charles. "That there thing is full cocked and air-triggered." I withered, or rather tried to wither him with a glance, but this unbelieving keeper only stared back at me with insolence in his round and bird-like eyes. Never before had I felt quite so angry with a menial. Then a horrible doubt struck me. Supposing I should miss? I knew very little of the manner of flight of English wood-pigeons, which are not difficult to miss with a bullet, and nothing at all of these particular rifles, though a glance at them showed me that they were exquisite weapons of their sort and by a great maker. If I muffed the thing now, how should I bear the scorn of Charles and the polite amusement of his noble master? Almost I prayed that no more pigeons would put in an appearance, and thus that the issue of my supposed skill might be left in doubt. But this was not to be. These birds came from far in ones or twos to search for their favorite food, and the fact that others had been scared away did not cause them to cease from coming. Presently, I heard Charles mutter, "Now then, look out, Governor. Here's your chance of teaching his lordship how to do it, though he does happen to be the best shot in these counties." While he spoke, 2 pigeons appeared, one a little behind the other, coming down very straight. As they reached the opening in the ilex grove, they hovered, preparing to alight, for of us they could see nothing, one at a distance of about 50 and the other of, say, 70 yards away. I took the nearest, got onto it, allowing for the drop and the angle, and touched the trigger of the rifle, which fell to my shoulder very sweetly. The bullet struck that pigeon on the crop, out of which fell a shower of acorns that it had been eating as it sank to the ground, stone dead. Number 2 pigeon, realizing danger, began to mount upwards almost straight. I fired the second barrel, and by good luck shot its head off. Then I snatched the other rifle, which Charles had been loading automatically from his outstretched hand, for at that moment I saw 2 more pigeons coming. At the first, I risked a difficult shot and hit it far back, knocking out its tail, but bringing it, still fluttering, to the ground. The other 2 I covered, but when I touched the trigger, there was a click, no more. This was my opportunity of coming even with Charles, and I availed myself of it. "Young man," I said, while he gaped at me open-mouthed, "you should learn to be careful with rifles, which are dangerous weapons. If you give one to a shooter that is not loaded, it shows that you are capable of anything." Then I turned, and addressing Lord Ragnall, added, "I must apologize for that 3rd shot of mine, which was infamous, for I committed a similar fault to that against which I warned you, sir, and did not fire far enough ahead. However, it may serve to show your attendant the difference between the tail of a pigeon and an oak leaf." And I pointed to one of the feathers of the poor bird, which was still drifting to the ground. "Well, if this here snipe of a chap ain't the devil in boots!" exclaimed Charles to himself. But his master cut him short with a look, then lifted his hat to me and said, "Sir, the practice much surpasses the precept, which is unusual. I congratulate you upon a skill that almost partakes of the marvelous, unless, indeed, chance—" And he stopped. "It is natural that you should think so," I replied, "but if more pigeons come, and Mr. Charles will make sure that he loads the rifle, I hope to undeceive you." At this moment, however, a loud shout from Scroop, who was looking for me, reinforced by a shrill cry uttered by Miss Manners, banished every pigeon within half a mile, a fact of which I was not sorry, since who knows whether I should have hit all or any of the next 3 birds. "I think my friends are calling me, so I will bid you good morning," I said awkwardly. "One moment, sir," he exclaimed. "Might I first ask you your name? Mine is Ragnall, Lord Ragnall." "And mine is Allan Quatermain," I said. "Oh," he answered, "that explains matters. Charles, this is Mr. Scroop's friend, the gentleman that you said exaggerated. I think you had better apologize." But Charles was gone, to pick up the pigeons, I suppose. At this moment, Scroop and the young lady appeared, having heard our voices, and a general explanation ensued. "Mr. Quatermain has been giving me a lesson in shooting pigeons on the wing with a small-bore rifle," said Lord Ragnall, pointing to the dead birds that still lay upon the ground. "He is competent to do that," said Scroop. "Painfully competent," replied his lordship. "If you don't believe me, ask the underkeeper." "It is the only thing I can do," I explained modestly. "Rifle shooting is my trade, and I have made a habit of practicing at birds on the wing with ball. I have no doubt that with a shotgun your lordship would leave me nowhere, for that is a game at which I have had little practice, except when shooting for the pot in Africa." "Yes," interrupted Scroop, "you wouldn't have any chance at that, Allan, against one of the finest shots in England." "I'm not so sure," said Lord Ragnall, laughing pleasantly. "I have an idea that Mr. Quatermain is full of surprises. However, with his leave, we'll see. If you have a day to spare, Mr. Quatermain, we are going to shoot through the home coverts tomorrow, which haven't been touched till now, and I hope you will join us. It is most kind of you, but that is impossible, I answered with firmness. I have no gun here. Oh, never mind that, Mr. Quatermain. I have a pair of breech-loaders. These were new things at that date, which have been sent down to me to try. I am going to return them, because they are much too short in the stock for me. I think they would just suit you, and you are quite welcome to the use of them. Again I excused myself, guessing that the discomfited Charles would put all sorts of stories about concerning me, and not wishing to look foolish before a party of grand strangers, no doubt chosen for their skill at this particular form of sport. "Well, Allan," exclaimed Scroop, who always had a talent for saying the wrong thing, "you are quite right not to go into a competition with Lord Ragnall over high pheasants." I flushed, for there was some truth in his blundering remark, whereon Lord Ragnall said with ready tact, "I asked Mr. Quatermain to shoot, not to a shooting match, Scroop, and I hope he'll come." This left me no option, and with a sinking heart, I had to accept. "Sorry I can't ask you too, Scroop," said his lordship, when details had been arranged, "but we can only manage 7 guns at this shoot. But will you and Miss Manners come to dine and sleep tomorrow evening? I should like to introduce your future wife to my future wife," he added, colouring a little. Miss Manners, being devoured with curiosity as to the wonderful Miss Holmes, of whom she had heard so much but never actually seen, accepted at once, before her lover could get out a word, whereon Scroop volunteered to bring me over in the morning and load for me. Being possessed by a terror that I should be handed over to the care of the unsympathetic Charles, I replied that I should be very grateful, and so the thing was settled. On our way home we passed through a country town, of which I forget the name, and the sight of a gunsmith's shop there reminded me that I had no cartridges. So I stopped to order some, as fortunately Lord Ragnall had mentioned that the guns he was going to lend me were 12 bores. The tradesman asked me how many cartridges I wanted, and when I replied 100, stared at me and said, "If, as I understood, sir, you are going to the big winter shoot at Ragnall tomorrow, you had better make it 350 at least. I shall be there to watch, like lots of others, and I expect to see nearly 200 fired by each gun at the last lake stand." "Very well," I answered, fearing to show more ignorance by further discussion. "I will call for the cartridges on my way tomorrow morning. Please load them with 3 drachms of powder." "Yes, sir, and 1 ounce and 1/8 of No. 5 shot, sir? That's what all the gentlemen use." "No," I answered. "No. 3, please be sure as to that. Good evening." The gunsmith stared at me, and as I left the shop, I heard him remark to his assistant, "That African gent must think he's going out to shoot ostriches with buckshot. I expect he ain't no good, whatever they may say about him."